Below the orbit of Neptune, beyond the last familiar diagrams from childhood, the solar system begins to change its face. Most people are taught to imagine our cosmic home as a tidy arrangement. The sun at the center, the planets circling in elegant order, the asteroids scattered like leftover stone, the comets drifting in from the dark, and then, after the outer planets, a long quiet fade into emptiness. It is a comforting picture, simple, balanced, almost complete. But Voyager taught us that this image, though useful, is also strangely incomplete. Because the true solar system does not end where the planets thin out. It does not fade politely into blackness. It stretches far beyond the bright architecture of worlds and moons into regions so cold and subtle that they seem less like places and more like conditions. And out there, where the sunlight grows weak and distance becomes difficult to imagine, Voyager began to uncover something that changed the meaning of our neighborhood forever. When the two Voyager spacecraft were launched in 1977, they were not sent out to solve the final shape of the solar system. They were built with a more focused ambition. They would race outward and take advantage of a rare alignment of the giant planets, using gravity itself as a staircase. Voyager 1 would visit Jupiter and Saturn. Voyager 2 would go farther, crossing paths with Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Even that alone would have been enough to secure their place in history. They revealed volcanoes erupting on Io, storms larger than Earth, icy moons with cracked surfaces, rings far more delicate and complicated than anyone expected, and entire planetary systems that felt less like distant dots and more like living worlds. Yet what makes Voyager unforgettable is not only what it found among the planets, it is what happened after the planets were gone. Because the strange truth is that Voyager kept going. Long after the cameras had taken their great portraits, long after the dramatic flybys had ended, long after the headlines should have faded into memory, the spacecraft continued into a darkness that no mission had ever entered before. They did not slow down to rest. They did not turn back. They did not stop to wait for the human imagination to catch up. They simply kept moving year after year, carrying instruments, a weakening voice, and a question no one had fully answered. What exactly is the solar system once the planets are behind you? At first, that question sounds easy. The solar system is the sun and everything that orbits it. That is the common answer. And yet the farther Voyager traveled, the less satisfying that answer became. Because if the solar system is only a collection of orbital paths, then its story becomes strangely empty after Neptune. Beyond the last major planet, the old map seems to lose confidence. But space does not. Space keeps going. The sun keeps acting. Invisible structures continue outward. Magnetic fields stretch into distance. Charged particles race away from the star. Pressure builds against pressure. The edge is no longer a line you can draw with a pencil. It becomes something dynamic, breathing, unstable, and vast. This is where the familiar picture begins to fracture. The planets are not the walls of our system. They are not even its final meaningful landmarks. They are more like bright islands inside a much greater ocean of influence. The real solar system is not just made of bodies you can see. It is also made of forces, of motion, of plasma, of fields, of energy flowing outward from the sun in every direction, claiming space not with stone, but with pressure. Voyager did not simply leave the realm of planets. It entered a hidden extension of the sun itself. To feel how strange that is, it helps to forget the textbook for a moment and imagine the sun not as a glowing object suspended in stillness, but as a constant act of release. Every second, the sun pours material outward. Not just light, which reaches us in a little more than 8 minutes, but a wind made of charged particles streaming into space at extraordinary speeds. This solar wind does not stop at Mars. It does not politely fade near Jupiter. It rushes outward for unimaginable distances, dragging the sun's magnetic influence with it, filling interplanetary space with a restless, invisible weather. The planets do not float in emptiness. They float inside the extended breath of the sun. That fact alone changes everything. It means Earth is not merely orbiting a star. Earth is living inside a stellar outflow, Every ocean tide, every mountain range, every sleeping city, every living cell in the history of our planet has existed inside a giant bubble carved out by solar wind. We do not usually feel this. The atmosphere protects us. Earth's magnetic field shelters us. The ordinary human day gives no hint that we are nested inside layers of invisible defense. But Voyager was built to go where those defenses fade, and in doing so, it revealed a solar system less like a clockwork diagram and more like an enormous living boundary pushing against the galaxy around it. For a long time, humanity thought of deep space as silence. The farther from the sun, the quieter it must become. Yet Voyager found something subtler and more unnerving. The farther out it went, the more the solar system began to feel like a negotiation, not a possession, not a fixed kingdom ruled without contest. A negotiation. The sun pushes outward, the galaxy presses inward, and between those two realities, our entire system takes shape. In the inner regions, we barely notice this. The sun dominates so completely that its presence seems absolute. Light floods the worlds. Gravity controls the dance. The solar wind races out with confidence. But as Voyager crossed the giant planets and traveled into the remote outskirts, it became clear that the sun's rule has texture. It has limits. It has a frontier. And like all frontiers, it is not clean. What makes this so difficult for the mind to hold is scale. Human beings are not built to feel tens of billions of miles. We can understand them as numbers, but not as lived reality. 1,000,000 miles already sounds immense. 1,000,000,000 sounds abstract. By the time distance reaches the regions Voyager entered, numbers stop feeling spatial and start feeling philosophical. The spacecraft became emissaries to a place where our intuition fails. Sunlight there is no longer warm brightness. It is a diminished memory. Time delay stretches communication into long patience. Commands do not arrive quickly. Signals return faintly. The spacecraft itself becomes almost dreamlike. A machine from the 1970s still whispering across the dark while everything around it grows harder to imagine. And still, it kept finding structure. That is the most astonishing thing. Not that Voyager went far, but that far away was not empty. The darkness beyond the planets was not just spare room after the interesting things were over. It was a domain with its own physics, its own thresholds, its own hidden weather. It was there that scientists were forced to let go of the old intuition that the solar system is mostly a family portrait of worlds. Voyager hinted that the planets might actually be the most visible, but not the most defining feature of our system. The true shape of home is drawn by things we cannot see directly, streams of particles, arcs of magnetic force, pressure against interstellar matter, a boundary made not of rock, but of conflict. This is where the story becomes difficult in the best possible way. Because the farther Voyager traveled, the more it suggested that the solar system is not an arrangement sitting calmly in a void. It is an active bubble moving through the galaxy, a bubble inflated by the sun, distorted by motion, compressed by what lies beyond, and perhaps reshaped by regions of space we have not yet fully understood. That means our cosmic home is not static. It is not permanent in the way old diagrams imply. It is an interaction, a temporary shelter created by a star that is itself moving through a much larger environment. Suddenly, the solar system feels less like architecture and more like weather. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine that everything human beings have ever known has unfolded inside a vast invisible cocoon generated by our star. Every empire, every language, every animal that ever lifted its head toward the sky, every child that ever learned the names of the planets, all of it happened inside a space already shaped by an unseen boundary far beyond Pluto. We were never simply orbiting the sun. We were living inside its extended domain, wrapped in a structure so large and subtle that we did not truly understand it until a machine built before the internet drifted far enough to begin touching its edges. There is something hauntingly beautiful about that. The oldest stories looked up at the stars and imagined heavens beyond human reach. Modern science replaced myth with measurement, but Voyager brought back a different kind of awe. Not the awe of fantasy, but the awe of realizing that reality is already more mysterious than our first explanations. The solar system turned out not to be smaller than we hoped, but larger and stranger. The planets were only the lit foreground. Beyond them waited the real question. How far does the sun remain? The sun. Even now, that question unsettles the imagination. We tend to think of stars by what they illuminate. But a star is not only its visible disk. A star also extends itself through wind, magnetism, radiation, and pressure. It reaches into space not just with light, but with authority. Voyager began measuring the slow fading of that authority, and the farther it went, the more thrilling the picture became, because there was no sharp cinematic border, no glowing wall, no gate with a sign announcing that the known world was over. There were only changes in the behavior of particles, shifts in the character of the magnetic field, subtle clues that the spacecraft was moving through layered regions where one regime gave way to another. That quietness makes the story more powerful, not less. In films, the edge of a realm is dramatic. In nature, the deepest transitions are often almost invisible. A reading climbs, another falls. Noise becomes pattern, pattern becomes evidence, and slowly, a realization forms. The boundary of the solar system is not a line drawn by human convenience. It is a real physical zone where the sun begins to lose its total command. This is why Voyager matters in a way few missions ever will. It did not just send back spectacular images. It redefined the size and meaning of the place we live in. It turned our neighborhood from a simple planetary chart into a layered frontier. It made the solar system feel alive at its edges, not alive in a biological sense, but in the sense that it responds, resists, and interacts with a larger environment. It has skin, it has pressure, it has a shape influenced by forces beyond itself. And perhaps the most humbling part is how accidental this deeper discovery feels. The spacecraft were not originally celebrated as scouts of the final border. They became that because they endured, because their power systems held on, because engineers kept listening, because the signal, faint as it was, still arrived. There is something deeply moving about that. A mission designed in one era survived long enough to answer a different question entirely. It is as if Voyager outlived its assignment and wandered into truth by persistence alone. That truth is harder to forget once you feel it. The solar system is not a neat shelf of planets fading into nothing. It is a moving sphere of influence with hidden outer layers. It is a protective domain, but not a perfect one. It is immense, but not infinite. It is shaped by the sun, but also by what the sun moves through. And Voyager, inching outward through the cold, taught us to think of our home not as a static map, but as a fragile territory inside a much larger sea. If that sounds unsettling, it should. It means the calm order we teach ourselves is only the beginning. Beyond the last planet lies not emptiness, but a region where the meaning of the solar system starts to change. The farther Voyager traveled, the more it revealed that our home has outer rooms we never see, corridors of invisible force, and thresholds where familiarity begins to fail. It showed that the known worlds are only the first layer of the story, and that is where the real wonder begins. Because once you accept that the solar system is a vast, invisible bubble around the sun, another question rises from the dark almost immediately. If we are inside a bubble, then what is pressing against it from the outside? What kind of ocean surrounds a star? What does it mean for a civilization to discover not just the contents of its home, but the skin of that home? Voyager was the first object ever built by human hands to move toward an answer. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a patience almost beyond belief. Night after night, year after year, it continued. Its camera long retired, its mission rewritten by distance, the giant planets now far behind, the sun smaller, the darkness ahead more honest, and still the spacecraft flew on, into a place where no map from childhood could fully guide it, a place where the solar system stopped looking like a set of circles and began to resemble a breathing shield stretched against the galaxy. That is the image worth holding on to as this journey deepens. Not 8 planets lined up in order, but a tiny world like ours, living far inside an invisible shell made by the sun. A shell so large that entire generations passed before we even understood it was there. A shell that keeps back part of the violence of interstellar space. A shell with an edge. And somewhere in the darkness, an aging spacecraft still moving outward, and carrying our questions toward that edge. So before you drift farther into this story, take a quiet moment and let that scale settle in. The planets were never the whole map. They were only the lanterns nearest the center. Voyager showed us that home is larger, stranger, and less secure than we once believed. And what it found next only made that mystery deeper. If this is the kind of cosmic darkness you want to keep exploring, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because the farther Voyager goes, the less the solar system resembles anything you were ever taught to expect. The farther Voyager traveled, the more the solar system stopped feeling like a place and began to feel like a force. That is the strange transition at the center of this story. In the beginning, our home in space seems easy to picture because it is built from visible things. A star, a sequence of planets, rings, moons, comets, asteroids, objects, surfaces, shapes, distances. The mind prefers these because they can be imagined. You can draw them. You can compare them. You can place them in order. But once Voyager crossed beyond the bright architecture of the known planets, that comforting picture began to thin out, and something less intuitive took its place. The solar system revealed itself not merely as a collection of worlds, but as an invisible domain continuously created by the sun itself. This is where the story becomes more beautiful, and a little more unsettling. The sun does not simply sit at the center of the solar system and illuminate it. It does something far more active than that. It pours itself outward. Every second, whether anyone is watching or not, the sun releases a constant stream of charged particles into space. Protons, electrons, atomic fragments accelerated by heat and magnetism until they rush away from the star in all directions. This flow is called the solar wind, though wind is almost too gentle a word. It is not a breeze. It is a continuous expansion, a steady outward flood of matter and magnetic influence. It carries pieces of the sun into the dark and reshapes the space through which it moves. For a long time, that fact sounded technical, distant, and easy to overlook. But when Voyager kept going beyond the outer planets, the solar wind stopped being a detail and became the story itself. Because the farther the spacecraft traveled, the more we began to understand that the planets are suspended inside this enormous outward moving field. They are not simply orbiting in blank emptiness. They are embedded in the breath of the sun. That changes the emotional scale of everything. It means Earth, for all its oceans and continents and fragile weather, exists inside a structure vastly larger than itself. Jupiter exists inside it. Saturn, with all its rings, exists inside it. Neptune, cold and blue and almost impossibly remote, exists inside it too. The solar wind extends far beyond the worlds we learn by name. It forms a gigantic cavity in space, a region where the sun's particles and magnetic field dominate over the surrounding medium. This cavity is called the heliosphere, though the name barely captures how strange it really is. It is not a shell in the ordinary sense. It is not a wall made of matter. It is a moving, shifting, living frontier inflated by a star. The easiest way to imagine it is as a bubble, but even that is only partly true. Human bubbles are fragile skins surrounding air. The heliosphere is more elusive. It has no clear surface you could touch, no visible membrane drifting in blackness, and yet it behaves as if it is there. The sun, through the solar wind, pushes outward against the thin material that fills interstellar space. In doing so, it carves out a vast region around itself, a region where solar influence matters deeply. The heliosphere is that region. It is the sun's extended domain, not its light alone, not its gravity alone, but its moving pressure and magnetism written into space across unimaginable distance. What Voyager began to reveal is that this invisible bubble may be one of the most important structures in the entire solar system. That is not because it is dramatic to look at. In fact, it cannot really be looked at in the usual sense at all. It is important because it quietly changes the conditions under which every planet exists. It helps shield the inner worlds from some fraction of the high-energy cosmic radiation that moves through the galaxy. It creates a transitional environment between our star and the interstellar medium beyond. It means that life on Earth did not emerge in neutral space, but inside the extended influence of a protective stellar outflow. This is one of those truths that becomes more astonishing the longer you sit with it. Every creature that has ever lived on this planet, from the first microbial life in ancient oceans to every bird, every whale, every forest, every human city glowing through the night, has existed within this giant invisible shield. We usually speak of Earth's atmosphere as our protection. We speak of the magnetic field as our guardian. Both are real, both are precious, but beyond them lies another layer so vast that it takes the entire solar system to describe it. We are not only sheltered locally, we are sheltered cosmically. Voyager helped us understand that by leaving the familiar behind. As it traveled outward, the spacecraft moved through a region where the solar wind still raced away from the sun at enormous speed. But what mattered was not only that it was moving through particles. What mattered was that those particles carried the sun's magnetic field far beyond the visible body of the star. This is where the old intuition about stars begins to fail. We tend to imagine a star as ending where its glowing surface ends, but the truth is that stars have afterlives in space. They continue outward through radiation, through wind, through magnetic influence, through the patterns they force upon the surrounding medium. The visible sun is only the beginning of the sun, and the heliosphere is one of its largest signatures. If you could see it from far outside, which no human eye ever has, you might not see a neat sphere. You might see something stranger. A gigantic region shaped by motion and resistance, swollen by the continuous pressure of solar wind, but also compressed and distorted by the environment through which the entire solar system moves. Because our star is not standing still. It is traveling through the Milky Way, carrying all the planets with it. So the heliosphere is not a perfect geometric monument. It is more like the changing envelope around a moving source, stretched and pressed by the conditions of the galaxy around it. That idea alone can keep the mind awake at night. It means the solar system is not merely arranged around the sun. It is being carried by the sun through a much larger sea. And as it moves, the heliosphere responds. It bulges, it narrows, it shifts. It is shaped by what is outside as much as by what is inside. So when Voyager moved toward the outer reaches of the solar system, it was not heading toward a static border. It was approaching a living negotiation between the star that made us and the interstellar environment waiting beyond. And that is what gives the journey its quiet tension. The farther Voyager went, the more the sun's invisible bubble became not just a scientific fact, but a kind of suspense. At first, we might assume that the heliosphere is simply a larger version of what happens around Earth. A magnetic field, a boundary, a region of protection. But on the scale of the solar system, everything becomes more complex. The solar wind changes over time because the sun changes over time. Solar activity rises and falls across cycles. Eruptions send disturbances racing outward. The wind is not identical in all directions. Different regions of space may respond differently. The heliosphere is not a polished object preserved in perfection. It is dynamic, breathing, variable, and shaped by events at the sun that can take months or years to fully propagate outward. In other words, Voyager was not just traveling through distance. It was traveling through delayed consequences. A burst of activity from the sun could eventually alter conditions far from the planets. Magnetic structures twisted near the solar surface could be carried outward into regions no human had ever touched. The spacecraft was exploring a place where time and distance became deeply entangled. What happened at the sun did not stay at the sun. It unfolded slowly across billions of miles, turning outer space into a vast memory of solar behavior. That is such a remarkable thing to consider. When you look at the sun from Earth, it seems immediate. Light arrives quickly. Warmth arrives quickly. Day follows dawn without revealing the scale of what lies between. But Voyager entered a realm where the sun became delayed. Its influence still reached outward, still structured the environment, but in forms stretched across immense spans. The heliosphere is, in part, the accumulated reach of the sun written into time. This is why Voyager's journey into the outer solar system feels almost like descending through layers of thought. Near the inner planets, the sun is obvious. It dominates the sky. Its energy is immediate. But far beyond Saturn, far beyond Uranus and Neptune, the star becomes visually weaker while its hidden structures remain vast. It is as if the sun's visible body recedes, but its invisible hand lingers. That contrast makes the outer solar system feel deeply uncanny. Light grows faint, but influence persists. Warmth thins, but power remains. The heliosphere turns distance into something emotionally complicated. The sun is both far away and still all around you. And because of that, Voyager began teaching us something profound about where we live. We do not live only in a planetary system. We live in a stellar bubble. That sentence sounds simple, but it changes the scale of belonging. It means our neighborhood is not defined solely by orbiting rocks and gas giants. It is defined by an envelope of solar matter and magnetism extending far into darkness. It means the sun is not merely the center of our system in the geometric sense. It is the engine constantly inflating the medium in which the entire system is embedded. The heliosphere is not a decorative feature of the solar system. It is one of its deepest realities. And perhaps that is why Voyager's findings feel larger than the spacecraft itself. It was a machine with limited power, instruments designed decades ago, a body no larger than a small car. Yet it was traveling into a structure so immense that the human mind struggles to emotionally grasp it. The contrast is almost poetic. A tiny, aging artifact of one species drifting through the invisible skin of an entire star's domain. The spacecraft could not see that domain with eyes. It could only feel it through measurements, shifts in particles, changes in magnetic behavior, variations in plasma conditions, tiny clues assembled into a revelation. The solar system was not ending. It was becoming less visible. That is a chillingly beautiful thought. Sometimes reality does not disappear as we move outward. Sometimes it simply changes form until our old senses can no longer recognize it. Voyager made us confront that directly. The outer solar system was not an empty afterthought. It was full of invisible structure. The heliosphere gave shape to that emptiness. It transformed blackness into environment. Suddenly, the space between the planets and the stars no longer seemed neutral. It became contested, prepared, conditioned by the sun's long reach. And with that understanding came a deeper unease. If the heliosphere protects us to some degree, then its outer boundary matters enormously. It is not just the edge of a region, it is the edge of a shield. Imagine what that means for the history of Earth. For billions of years, our planet has traveled around the sun while the sun itself moved through the galaxy. The heliosphere likely expanded and contracted as surrounding interstellar conditions changed. It may have strengthened or weakened in ways that subtly altered the radiation environment of the solar system. That means life on Earth may have unfolded beneath a changing cosmic shelter, one whose full importance we are only beginning to understand. Voyager did not solve all of those questions, but it revealed enough to make them unavoidable. And that is where the story becomes difficult to stop listening to. Because once you understand that our star creates a bubble around everything we know, another question begins to press inward with extraordinary force. If this bubble is real, then where exactly does it end? Where does the sun stop being the dominant sculptor of local space? What does the transition feel like? Is it gradual? Is it chaotic? Is it sharp? And what waits beyond? Voyager was heading toward those questions long before we had words dramatic enough to frame them. The spacecraft kept moving outward through the heliosphere, and every mile mattered because every mile brought it closer to the place where the solar system stops being only ours. There is something almost mythic in that journey, though it is built entirely from physics. An emissary from the inner worlds, moving away from warmth and light, through the expanding breath of the sun, toward a border no human had ever encountered. It did not carry weapons. It did not carry passengers. It carried instruments and patience. And somehow that makes the journey feel even lonelier. This was not conquest. It was listening. Listening to particles. Listening to the faint hum of plasma. Listening to magnetic fields change their character in the dark. The heliosphere, in this sense, is not just a structure. It is a long sentence the sun has been speaking into the galaxy for billions of years. Voyager was the first machine we ever built that could follow that sentence far enough to hear where it begins to break. And when you think about it that way, the solar system becomes almost unbearably mysterious. Not because it is unknowable, but because it was hiding in plain sight. We always knew the sun emitted particles. We always knew stars had influence beyond their visible surfaces. But knowing a fact and feeling its scale are very different things. Voyager gave us feeling. It turned abstraction into frontier. It made the heliosphere seem less like a definition in a scientific paper and more like the great outer weather of our own existence. This is also why the old classroom image of the solar system now feels too quiet, too finished, too domesticated. The real solar system is stranger. It has an outer atmosphere of sorts, though made not of breathable gases but charged particles and fields. It has a boundary where pressure meets pressure. It has regions where the solar wind runs free and regions where that freedom begins to fail. It has an edge that is not simply distant, but meaningful. And because of Voyager, that edge is no longer a philosophical guess. It became a measurable destination. Even now, that knowledge can change the way you think about night. Every star in the sky may possess its own version of this hidden extension. Every planetary system may be wrapped in its own stellar bubble, its own contested boundary, its own subtle shield against the interstellar dark. That would mean the galaxy is not merely filled with stars and planets, but with overlapping domains of influence, each star pressing outward, each bubble shaped by the sea between them. Voyager, by teaching us about our own heliosphere, may have quietly revealed a pattern that extends across the Milky Way itself. And still, there is something especially intimate about our own, because this one is home. This is the bubble that surrounded Earth while life learned to breathe, crawl, bloom, hunt, dream, build, and wonder. This is the invisible architecture beneath every sunrise and every ancient myth. And for most of human history, we had no idea it was there. One that may be the most humbling part of all. The true size of our home was larger than our vision, larger than our myths, larger than our first sciences. It took a machine traveling for decades into the dark just to begin tracing the outline. Voyager did not make the solar system bigger in a physical sense. It made our understanding of it larger. And sometimes those are almost the same thing, because what we can imagine changes how we live inside the truth. Once you know the heliosphere exists, once you feel that the sun has wrapped us in a moving shield of its own making, the planets no longer seem like isolated ornaments around a star. They feel more like inhabitants of a shared interior, travelers within the same great envelope, members of a deeper structure whose most important walls are invisible. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. It turns the solar system from a diagram into an organism, like domain of flow, pressure, and boundary. And Voyager, still going, still whispering across the black, became our first witness to that hidden anatomy. But the most gripping part of the journey was still ahead, because no matter how astonishing the heliosphere is, it raises a darker question. What happens when the solar wind finally weakens? What happens when the sun's breath, after billions of miles of outward rushing, begins to lose against the pressure beyond? What shape does that surrender take? What does a star's frontier sound like when a spacecraft crosses into it alone? That is where the next layer of the mystery waits. So, if this vast, invisible shelter around the sun already feels larger and stranger than the solar system you were taught to imagine, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because Voyager was heading toward the moment when our star's protective bubble would begin to falter. And what it found there was far beyond anything most people ever picture when they look up at the night sky. There is a point in the outer solar system where distance stops feeling like distance and starts feeling like resistance. By the time Voyager had passed the giant planets and continued into regions no mission had ever explored before, the story was no longer about travel in the ordinary sense. It was no longer just a spacecraft moving away from the sun. It was a spacecraft moving deeper into the sun's invisible territory, toward a place where that territory would begin to fail. And that is what makes this part of the journey so haunting. The farther Voyager went, the less the solar system felt like a collection of objects, and the more it felt like a struggle between opposing pressures. The sun was still pushing outward. The galaxy was already pressing inward. Somewhere ahead lay the region where those two influences would begin to collide in earnest. This is where the outer solar system becomes difficult to imagine because it is no longer a quiet extension of the worlds we know. It becomes a borderland, not a border marked by stone or light, but by changing behavior, by particles slowing down, by magnetic fields twisting, by energy rearranging itself, by a star that has ruled its neighborhood for billions of years, gradually discovering that its reach is not endless. For a long time, the solar wind leaves the sun with astonishing confidence. It races outward through the planetary realm, carrying charged particles and magnetic structure far into darkness. Near Earth, near Jupiter, even near Saturn, this outward flow remains part of the invisible normal. It is the sun continuing to act across space. But the farther you go, the stranger the problem becomes. Because the solar wind is not expanding into true emptiness. It is expanding into a galaxy that already contains its own matter, its own magnetic fields, its own cosmic pressure. The heliosphere is not floating in nothing. It is pushing into something else, and eventually, that something pushes back. This is one of the most beautiful and unsettling realizations Voyager gave us. The solar system is not surrounded by passive silence. It is surrounded by the interstellar medium, the extremely thin material spread between stars. Thin beyond ordinary human intuition, yes, but not absent. It has particles, it has plasma, it has magnetic properties, it has pressure. It is a real environment, and as the sun moves through it, the heliosphere must continuously negotiate its shape against that surrounding sea. That means the outer regions of the solar system are not calm outskirts, where everything simply fades. They are more like the remote edge of a weather system, where the influence of one domain begins to buckle under the force of another. Voyager did not head into a blank beyond. It headed into a zone of compression. This is where a strange phrase enters the story, one that sounds almost cinematic and yet describes something profoundly real: the termination shock. The name alone feels dramatic, but the reality is quieter and in some ways more unnerving. The solar wind streams outward from the sun at supersonic speeds, faster than the local speed at which disturbances in that plasma can travel. For immense distances, it surges through space as though the sun's authority were unchallenged. But eventually, the interstellar medium and the accumulated pressure at the heliosphere's frontier begin to matter enough that the solar wind can no longer maintain that speed. It slows abruptly, it heats up, it becomes more turbulent. Its easy outward confidence is gone. This does not happen in a blaze of visible light. No giant wall appears. No cosmic surf crashes in a way a human eye could admire. It happens in data, in the changing energy of particles, in the altered behavior of the plasma surrounding the spacecraft. But that almost makes it more powerful, because it means Voyager was detecting not scenery, but the hidden mechanics of a frontier. Imagine traveling through a vast, dark ocean where nothing seems to change, and then, little by little, the water begins to feel different. The currents lose their old rhythm. The pressure shifts. The flow that carried you outward is no longer smooth. Something beyond the horizon is pushing back, not with violence you can see, but with enough force to transform the medium around you. That is what Voyager was entering. A region where the sun's wind was no longer free. The termination shock is sometimes described as the place where the solar wind slows from supersonic to subsonic speed. That is scientifically true. But emotionally, it is something even stranger. It is the point where the sun begins to lose certainty. Until then, the solar wind is an assertion. It says the sun still commands this region. It still shapes the space around it. It still sends its influence outward with enough force to dominate the local conditions. But at the termination shock, that assertion begins to weaken. The outward stream can no longer ignore what lies beyond. The pressure of the galaxy has become impossible to outrun. That idea changes the mood of the solar system completely. It means our star does not simply shine into space. It contends with it. It struggles against it. It carves out a domain, yes, but only by continuously pushing. The heliosphere is not a static inheritance. It is an active achievement. And the farther Voyager traveled, the more obvious that became. Beyond the termination shock lies a region called the Helios Heath. And if the inner solar system feels like the bright interior of home, then the Helios sheath feels like its cold and uncertain outer skin. This is where the slowed solar wind, no longer racing freely, begins to pile up, heat up, and behave in more chaotic ways. The flow becomes disturbed. Magnetic fields are compressed and twisted. Particles can be accelerated. The environment grows more complex, more unstable, more difficult to reduce to a clean picture. It is not quite the sun's domain in the old confident sense, but neither is it yet the open interstellar medium beyond. It is a transition region, a kind of long surrender stretched across distance. And there is something deeply haunting about transitions in space. Human imagination tends to crave lines. We want a clean edge, a final border, a point where one thing ends and another begins. But nature often withholds that clarity. Instead, it offers gradients, zones, thresholds, regions where identity becomes ambiguous. The Helios sheath is exactly that kind of place. It is where the solar system becomes uncertain about itself. Voyager passed into that uncertainty alone. By then, the giant planets were unimaginably far behind. Their storms, rings, and moons had become part of memory. Ahead, there was no great world to photograph, no dramatic encounter waiting in visible light. There was only the invisible frontier, a spacecraft from the 1970s carrying instruments built by human hands, to drifting into a region where the sun's breath was slowing under pressure from the galaxy. The loneliness of that image is hard to overstate. Voyager was no longer exploring planets. It was exploring the idea of outside, and what it found suggested that outside is never simple. One of the most fascinating and subtle discoveries of this phase was that the heliosphere is not likely to be a perfect, balanced bubble. That would have been too neat, too symmetrical, too easy for the human mind to love. Instead, the evidence pointed towards something more irregular. The heliosphere seems to be shaped by the direction of the solar system's motion through the galaxy, by the surrounding interstellar magnetic field, and by the changing pressure of the medium beyond. In other words, the boundary of our cosmic home is not a perfect sphere. It is distorted. It may be compressed on one side, extended on another, bent and reshaped by conditions we do not fully control. That is such a beautiful correction to our old habits of thinking. Even when reality grants us a bubble around the sun, it refuses to give us a simple one. Our home is not an ideal form. It is a moving compromise. And if that is true, then Voyager was not just heading toward a distance. It was heading toward a geometry of stress, a place where the shape of the solar system itself had been sculpted by its contact with the galaxy, a place where the sun's influence was being squeezed, redirected, and slowly overcome. The spacecraft was revealing that home, at its largest scale, has contours shaped by conflict. There is something almost biological about that, not because the heliosphere is alive, but because it reacts. It changes shape in response to its environment. It has outer layers. It has regions of pressure and transition. It protects, but imperfectly. It adapts. It is a dynamic boundary. The solar system begins to seem less like a machine and more like a drifting vessel enclosed by an invisible hull that flexes under external force. That metaphor becomes especially powerful when you remember what the heliosphere may be doing for us. By deflecting part of the incoming cosmic radiation from deep space, it acts as a broad protective shield, Not absolute, not invulnerable, but significant. Which means the heliosheath and the regions near the sun's outer frontier are not just scientifically interesting. They may be tied to the conditions under which life on Earth has persisted. Voyager was approaching the place where that shielding weakens. It was nearing the region where the difference between inside and outside becomes more than abstract. This gives the voyage a tension that never needed explosions or spectacle. The spacecraft was moving toward the edge of protection itself, and in the heliosheath, the signs of that growing tension were already there. The solar wind had slowed. The environment had become more turbulent. Particle intensities shifted in ways that hinted at nearby transitions. Cosmic rays from the galaxy behaved differently. The magnetic field carried a new kind of importance. The old certainty of being inside the sun's freely expanding domain had been replaced by something messier, something compressed, something layered. Voyager was moving through a place where the solar system was under pressure. You can almost feel the psychological power of that if you let yourself imagine it slowly enough. Not a spaceship racing into deep space like an arrow. Not a triumphant march toward conquest, but a patient object crossing into a region where the medium itself is changing around it. The sun's influence thick with accumulated strain. The galaxy close enough now to distort what once seemed sovereign. The familiar growing ambiguous. The boundary still ahead, but its presence already sensed in the way everything behaves. This is the kind of discovery that alters not just facts, but atmosphere. Before Voyager, people could think of the solar system as fading outward into emptiness. After Voyager, it became harder to avoid a more dramatic truth. The solar system has a frontier zone, a place where the dominance of the sun is no longer easy, a place where the outward wind is forced to slow and reckon with what lies beyond, a place where our star's empire becomes negotiable. That word matters. Negotiable. Because the sun is not defeated in a single moment. It does not collapse at the edge. It yields gradually, through layers. It gives up speed before it gives up presence. It enters turbulence before it loses authority entirely. The heliosheath is, in that sense, a long and reluctant concession. And Voyager crossed it not with fanfare, but with measurement. The instruments on board became our senses in a realm where human intuition could not survive alone. Particle detectors, magnetometers, plasma observations, each reading a fragment of a landscape no eye could see. And from those fragments, a new image began to emerge. The outer solar system was not calm. It was structured by contest. The sun and the interstellar medium were not politely taking turns. They were pressing into one another, shaping a boundary that was neither fixed nor simple. Even more unsettling was the realization that this boundary might move. The sun's activity changes over time. Conditions in interstellar space can vary. The heliosphere expands and contracts. Its frontier shifts. That means the outer edge of our system is not just far away, it is alive to circumstance. A different epoch in the sun's history, a different region of the galaxy, a different balance of pressure, and the shape of home itself might not be the same. This thought opens something almost philosophical. Home, in the cosmic sense, is not only where you begin, it is also the shape of the protective influence surrounding you. And if that shape can change, then even at the largest scale, the place we belong is less permanent than it seems. Voyager was revealing that our neighborhood is not bordered by certainty. It is bordered by interaction. That may be why the mission feels increasingly emotional the farther from Earth it goes. Near the planets, wonder comes from seeing astonishing worlds. But in these outer regions, wonder comes from something quieter and perhaps more profound. It comes from realizing that our star has limits, that those limits are physical, that they can be felt, that they are not where the textbooks once implied, and that a lonely machine carrying the fading technology of another century was the first to reach them. There is a kind of reverence in that image. Voyager as a witness. Voyager as the first object built by life on Earth to move through the sun's troubled outer skin. Voyager not finding monuments but transitions, not finding alien cities, but the invisible tension between a star and the galaxy beyond. The discoveries are subtle, but they are vast in implication. They say that the solar system is bigger than the planets, more fragile than a neat diagram, and stranger at the edges than most people ever imagine. And still, the most important crossing had not yet come, because the termination shock and the heliosheath, for all their mystery, were not the end. They were only the warning signs. They were the long approach to the place where the sun's outward wind would finally fail to dominate it all. Somewhere ahead lay the heliopause, the true boundary where the solar wind would be stopped and the interstellar medium would begin to define the environment beyond. Voyager was not there yet in this phase of the journey, but everything in the data was beginning to whisper that it was close. That is the perfect kind of suspense for deep space. Not a countdown clock, not a visible gate, but a reality approaching through indirect signs. The particles are changing. The fields are tightening. The old regime is weakening. Something immense is near, and the spacecraft can only sense it by the way the darkness behaves. If you stay with that thought long enough, it becomes difficult to forget. The outer solar system is not empty. It is where the sun begins to lose control. It is where our cosmic shelter becomes strained. It is where the galaxy stops being a distant backdrop and starts becoming an active force pressing against the shape of home. Voyager entered that region first, and by doing so, it transformed the edge of the solar system from an idea into a place. A place without scenery in the usual sense. A place without horizons. A place measured in pressure, turbulence, and invisible change. But a place all the same. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden in this lonely part of the voyage. The universe does not save its greatest mysteries for the brightest objects. Sometimes the strangest truths are hidden in transitions, in outer layers, in quiet regions where one influence gives way to another. Sometimes the most astonishing discovery is not a new world, but the realization that the space between worlds has shape, drama, and consequence of its own. Voyager was teaching us to look at emptiness differently, not as absence, but as structure waiting to be understood. And the farther it traveled through the heliosheath, the more urgent the next question became. What would it mean to actually cross the final boundary? What would happen when the spacecraft moved beyond the sun's last direct protection and into the true interstellar medium? Would the transition be sharp? Would it be confusing? Would we recognize it when it happened? Or would the greatest crossing in the history of exploration arrive not as a spectacle, but as a change in numbers whispered back to Earth across billions of miles? That answer was coming. So if this silent frontier where the sun begins to lose its grip already feels more mysterious than most science fiction, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because Voyager was now approaching the very edge of the solar system's protection, and what it found there would change forever the way we understand our place in the dark. There is a point in the outer solar system where distance stops feeling like distance and starts feeling like resistance. By the time Voyager had passed the giant planets and continued into regions no mission had ever explored before, the story was no longer about travel in the ordinary sense. It was no longer just a spacecraft moving away from the sun. It was a spacecraft moving deeper into the sun's invisible territory, toward a place where that territory would begin to fail. And that is what makes this part of the journey so haunting. The farther Voyager went, the less the solar system felt like a collection of objects, and the more it felt like a struggle between opposing pressures. The sun was still pushing outward. The galaxy was already pressing inward. Somewhere ahead lay the region where those two influences would begin to collide in earnest. This is where the outer solar system becomes difficult to imagine because it is no longer a quiet extension of the worlds we know. It becomes a borderland, not a border marked by stone or light, but by changing behavior, by particles slowing down, by magnetic fields twisting, by energy rearranging itself, by a star that has ruled its neighborhood for billions of years, gradually discovering that its reach is not endless. For a long time, the solar wind leaves the sun with astonishing confidence. It races outward through the planetary realm, carrying charged particles and magnetic structure far into darkness. Near Earth, near Jupiter, even near Saturn, this outward flow remains part of the invisible normal. It is the sun continuing to act across space. But the farther you go, the stranger the problem becomes. Because the solar wind is not expanding into true emptiness. It is expanding into a galaxy that already contains its own matter, its own magnetic fields, its own cosmic pressure. The heliosphere is not floating in nothing. It is pushing into something else. And eventually, that something pushes back. This is one of the most beautiful and unsettling realizations Voyager gave us. The solar system is not surrounded by passive silence. It is surrounded by the interstellar medium, the extremely thin material spread between stars. Thin beyond ordinary human intuition? Yes, but not absent. It has particles, it has plasma, it has magnetic properties, it has pressure. It is a real environment, and as the sun moves through it, the heliosphere must continuously negotiate its shape against that surrounding sea. That means the outer regions of the solar system are not calm outskirts where everything simply fades. They are more like the remote edge of a weather system, where the influence of one domain begins to buckle under the force of another. Voyager did not head into a blank beyond. It headed into a zone of compression. This is where a strange phrase enters the story, one that sounds almost cinematic, and yet describes something profoundly real: the termination shock. The name alone feels dramatic, but the reality is quieter and in some ways more unnerving. The solar wind streams outward from the sun at supersonic speeds, faster than the local speed at which disturbances in that plasma can travel. For immense distances, it surges through space as though the sun's authority were unchallenged. But eventually, the interstellar medium and the accumulated pressure at the heliosphere's frontier begin to matter enough that the solar wind can no longer maintain that speed. It slows abruptly. It heats up. It becomes more turbulent. Its easy outward confidence is gone. This does not happen in a blaze of visible light. No giant wall appears. No cosmic surf crashes in a way a human eye could admire. It happens in data, in the changing energy of particles, in the altered behavior of the plasma surrounding the spacecraft. But that almost makes it more powerful, because it means Voyager was detecting not scenery, but the hidden mechanics of a frontier. Imagine traveling through a vast, dark ocean where nothing seems to change, and then, little by little, the water begins to feel different. The currents lose their old rhythm. The pressure shifts. The flow that carried you outward is no longer smooth. Something beyond the horizon is pushing back, not with violence you can see, but with enough force to transform the medium around you. That is what Voyager was entering, a region where the sun's wind was no longer free. The termination shock is sometimes described as the place where the solar wind slows from supersonic to subsonic speed. That is scientifically true. But emotionally, it is something even stranger. It is the point where the sun begins to lose certainty. Until then, the solar wind is an assertion. It says the sun still commands this region. It still shapes the space around it. It still sends its influence outward with enough force to dominate the local conditions. But, at the termination shock, that assertion begins to weaken. The outward stream can no longer ignore what lies beyond. The pressure of the galaxy has become impossible to outrun. That idea changes the mood of the solar system completely. It means our star does not simply shine into space. It contends with it. It struggles against it. It carves out a domain, yes, but only by continuously pushing. The heliosphere is not a static inheritance. It is an active achievement. And the farther Voyager traveled, the more obvious that became. Beyond the termination shock lies a region called the heliosheath. And if the inner solar system feels like the bright interior of home, then the heliosheath feels like its cold and uncertain outer skin. This is where the slowed solar wind, no longer racing freely, begins to pile up, heat up, and behave in more chaotic ways. The flow becomes disturbed. Magnetic fields are compressed and twisted. Particles can be accelerated. The environment grows more complex, more unstable, more difficult to reduce to a clean picture. It is not quite the sun's domain in the old confident sense, but neither is it yet the open interstellar medium beyond. It is a transition region, a kind of long surrender stretched across distance. And there is something deeply haunting about transitions in space. Human imagination tends to crave lines. We want a clean edge, a final border, a point where one thing ends and another begins. But nature often withholds that clarity. Instead, it offers gradients, zones, thresholds, regions where identity becomes ambiguous. The heliosheath is exactly that kind of place. It is where the solar system becomes uncertain about itself. Voyager passed into that uncertainty alone. By then, the giant planets were unimaginably far behind. Their storms, rings, and moons had become part of memory. Ahead, there was no great world to photograph, no dramatic encounter waiting in visible light. There was only the invisible frontier, a spacecraft from the 1970s, carrying instruments built by human hands, drifting into a region where the sun's breath was slowing under pressure from the galaxy. The loneliness of that image is hard to overstate. Voyager was no longer exploring planets. It was exploring the idea of outside. And what it found suggested that outside is never simple. One of the most fascinating and subtle discoveries of this phase was that the heliosphere is not likely to be a perfect, balanced bubble. That would have been too neat, too symmetrical, too easy for the human mind to love. Instead, the evidence pointed towards something more irregular. The heliosphere seems to be shaped by the direction of the solar system's motion through the galaxy, by the surrounding interstellar magnetic field, and by the changing pressure of the medium beyond. In other words, the boundary of our cosmic home is not a perfect sphere. It is distorted. It may be compressed on one side, extended on another, bent and reshaped by conditions we do not fully control. That is such a beautiful correction to our old habits of thinking. Even when reality grants us a bubble around the sun, it refuses to give us a simple one. Our home is not an ideal form. It is a moving compromise. And if that is true, then Voyager was not just heading toward a distance. It was heading toward a geometry of stress, a place where the shape of the solar system itself had been sculpted by its contact with the galaxy, a place where the sun's influence was being squeezed, redirected, and slowly overcome. The spacecraft was revealing that home, at its largest scale, has contours shaped by conflict. There is something almost biological about that, not because the heliosphere is alive, but because it reacts. It changes shape in response to its environment. It has outer layers, it has regions of pressure and transition. It protects, but imperfectly. It adapts. It is a dynamic boundary. The solar system begins to seem less like a machine and more like a drifting vessel, enclosed by an invisible hull that flexes under external force. That metaphor becomes especially powerful when you remember what the heliosphere may be doing for us. By deflecting part of the incoming cosmic radiation from deep space, it acts as a broad, protective shield. Not absolute, not invulnerable, but significant. Which means the heliosheath and the regions near the sun's outer frontier are not just scientifically interesting. They may be tied to the conditions under which life on Earth has persisted. Voyager was approaching the place where that shielding weakens. It was nearing the region where the difference between inside and outside becomes more than abstract. This gives the voyage a tension that never needed explosions or spectacle. The spacecraft was moving toward the edge of protection itself. And in the heliosheath, the signs of that growing tension were already there. The solar wind had slowed. The environment had become more turbulent. Particle intensities shifted in ways that hinted at nearby transitions. Cosmic rays from the galaxy behaved differently. The magnetic field carried a new kind of importance. The old certainty of being inside the sun's freely expanding domain had been replaced by something messier, something compressed, something layered. Voyager was moving through a place where the solar system was under pressure. You can almost feel the psychological power of that, if you let yourself imagine it slowly enough. Not a spaceship racing into deep space like an arrow, not a triumphant march toward conquest, but a patient object crossing into a region where the medium itself is changing around it. The sun's influence thick with accumulated strain. The galaxy close enough now to distort what once seemed sovereign. The familiar growing ambiguous. The boundary still ahead, but its presence already sensed in the way everything behaves. This is the kind of discovery that alters not just facts, but atmosphere. Before Voyager, people could think of the solar system as fading outward into emptiness. After Voyager, it became harder to avoid a more dramatic truth. The solar system has a frontier zone, a place where the dominance of the sun is no longer easy, a place where the outward wind is forced to slow and reckon with what lies beyond, a place where our star's empire becomes negotiable. That word matters. Negotiable. Because the sun is not defeated in a single moment. It does not collapse at the edge. It yields gradually through layers. It gives up speed before it gives up presence. It enters turbulence before it loses authority entirely. The heliosheath is, in that sense, a long and reluctant concession, and Voyager crossed it not with fanfare, but with measurement. The instruments on board became our senses in a realm where human intuition could not survive alone. Particle detectors, magnetometers, plasma observations, each reading a fragment of a landscape no eye could see. And from those fragments, a new image began to emerge. The outer solar system was not calm. It was structured by contest. The sun and the interstellar medium were not politely taking turns. They were pressing into one another, shaping a boundary that was neither fixed nor simple. Even more unsettling was the realization that this boundary might move. The sun's activity changes over time. Conditions in interstellar space can vary. The heliosphere expands and contracts. Its frontier shifts. That means the outer edge of our system is not just far away. It is alive to circumstance. A different epoch in the sun's history, a different region of the galaxy, a different balance of pressure, and the shape of home itself might not be the same. This thought opens something almost philosophical. Home, in the cosmic sense, is not only where you begin, it is also the shape of the protective influence surrounding you. And if that shape can change, then even at the largest scale, the place we belong is less permanent than it seems. Voyager was revealing that our neighborhood is not bordered by certainty. It is bordered by interaction. That may be why the mission feels increasingly emotional the farther from Earth it goes. Near the planets, wonder comes from seeing astonishing worlds. But in these outer regions, wonder comes from something quieter and perhaps more profound. It comes from realizing that our star has limits, that those limits are physical, that they can be felt, that they are not where the textbooks once implied, and that a lonely machine carrying the fading technology of another century was the first to reach them. There is a kind of reverence in that image. Voyager as a witness, Voyager as the first object built by life on Earth to move through the sun's troubled outer skin. Voyager not finding monuments, but transitions, not finding alien cities, but the invisible tension between a star and the galaxy beyond. The discoveries are subtle, but they are vast in implication. They say that the solar system is bigger than the planets, more fragile than a neat diagram, and stranger at the edges than most people ever imagine. And still, the most important crossing had not yet come. Because the termination shock and the heliosheath, for all their mystery, were not the end. They were only the warning signs. They were the long approach to the place where the sun's outward wind would finally fail to dominate it all. Somewhere ahead lay the heliopause, the true boundary where the solar wind would be stopped, and the interstellar medium would begin to define the environment beyond. Voyager was not there yet in this phase of the journey, but everything in the data was beginning to whisper that it was close. That is the perfect kind of suspense for deep space. Not a countdown clock, not a visible gate, but a reality approaching through indirect signs. The particles are changing. The fields are tightening. The old regime is weakening. Something immense is near, and the spacecraft can only sense it by the way the darkness behaves. If you stay with that thought long enough, it becomes difficult to forget. The outer solar system is not empty. It is where the sun begins to lose control. It is where our cosmic shelter becomes strained. It is where the galaxy stops being a distant backdrop and starts becoming an active force pressing against the shape of home. Voyager entered that region first, and by doing so, it transformed the edge of the solar system from an idea into a place without scenery in the usual sense, a place without horizons, a place measured in pressure, turbulence, and invisible change, but a place all the same. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden in this lonely part of the voyage. The universe does not save its greatest mysteries for the brightest objects. Sometimes the strangest truths are hidden in transitions, in outer layers, in quiet regions where one influence gives way to another. Sometimes the most astonishing discovery is not a new world, but the realization that the space between worlds has shape, drama, and consequence of its own. Voyager was teaching us to look at emptiness differently, not as absence, but as structure waiting to be understood. And the farther it traveled through the heliosheath, the more urgent the next question became. What would it mean to actually cross the final boundary? What would happen when the spacecraft moved beyond the sun's last direct protection and into the true interstellar medium? Would the transition be sharp? Would it be confusing? Would we recognize it when it happened? Or would the greatest crossing in the history of exploration arrive not as a spectacle, but as a change in numbers whispered back to Earth across billions of miles? That answer was coming. So if this silent frontier where the sun begins to lose its grip already feels more mysterious than most science fiction, subscribe to the channel and stay with me, because Voyager was now approaching the very edge of the solar system's protection, and what it found there would change forever the way we understand our place in the dark. No one on Earth watched Voyager cross the edge of the sun's protection with their own eyes. There was no shining gateway suspended in the dark, no visible curtain, no grand celestial border glowing like the entrance to another realm. The spacecraft did not lurch. It did not shudder in some dramatic way. It did not pass from light into shadow, or from one color of stars into another. If you had somehow been there beside it, drifting in that vast, cold distance, the moment might have looked almost indistinguishable from every moment before it. The same blackness, the same faint stars, the same lonely machine moving onward with a patience older than most living memories. And yet, in a way more profound than spectacle could ever capture, that crossing may have been one of the most extraordinary moments in human history. Because Voyager was not simply moving farther away. It was approaching the place where the sun stopped being the master of its local environment. It was nearing the Heliopause, the final boundary of the heliosphere, where the solar wind would no longer dominate the space around the spacecraft. Beyond that line, if line is even the right word, lay the true interstellar medium, not the distant idea of interstellar space, but its actual beginning, a region not shaped primarily by our star, but by the galaxy itself. This is what makes the event so haunting. Humanity's first entrance into interstellar space was not announced by a view. It was announced by a whisper in the data. For years, scientists had been waiting for signs that Voyager was approaching the outermost edge of the sun's influence. The clues had already begun to gather. The solar wind had slowed. The heliosheath had revealed itself as a turbulent zone of compressed particles and stressed magnetic fields. Cosmic rays from beyond the solar system were behaving differently. The sun's breath was no longer free. It was tangled, weakened, crowded by what pressed in from outside. Everything suggested that the final frontier was close. But close in deep space is a dangerous word. It can mean years. It can mean a distance so large that human language begins to lose its grip on the feeling of it. Then something began to change. One of the most important clues came not from anything Voyager saw, but from what started arriving in greater numbers. High, energy particles known as galactic cosmic rays began increasing sharply. These particles come from beyond our solar system, accelerated by violent events in the galaxy, by supernova explosions, by ancient stellar deaths, by processes so immense and remote that they turn entire regions of the Milky Way into engines of radiation. Inside the heliosphere, the solar wind helps hold back some fraction of this incoming storm. It acts like a kind of vast, imperfect shield, but near the heliopause, that shield weakens. The closer Voyager came to the edge, the more those galactic particles rose, as though the darkness outside had begun seeping through. At nearly the same time, particles associated with the solar wind fell away. This contrast was breathtaking in its quiet precision. One population of particles, born in the sun's domain, diminished. Another, born in the wider galaxy, surged. It was as if two voices had switched places in the same room. The familiar one grew faint. The foreign one grew strong. And from that shift, the meaning of the moment began to emerge. Voyager was reaching the limit of the sun's direct protection. It is difficult to overstate how emotionally strange that idea is once you let it settle in. For all of human history, every life has unfolded inside the heliosphere. Every ocean wave, every fossil, every cathedral, every dream, every machine, every whispered prayer, every first step on a distant moon, all of it has happened within the broad, protective bubble created by the sun. We had never touched the outside. We had looked toward the stars for millennia, but we had always done so from inside the sun's envelope. Voyager was changing that. Not symbolically, literally. And still, the crossing refused to be simple. Science, especially at the edge of the unknown, rarely grants a single elegant clue. It gives fragments. It gives contradictions. It gives readings that seem to point one way and then hesitate. Voyager's approach to the Heliopause was filled with this strange uncertainty. The particle data suggested a boundary was near. The changes were dramatic enough to feel historic. But one measurement in particular complicated the picture. Scientists expected the direction of the magnetic field to shift more obviously once the spacecraft entered interstellar space. Yet at first, that change did not appear as clearly as many had imagined. This made the crossing even more mysterious. Had Voyager truly left the heliosphere, or had it entered some transitional layer no one fully understood? Had the boundary been crossed? Or was the spacecraft moving through a kind of porch outside the front door, no longer truly inside but not yet clearly outside either? The heliopause, it seemed, was not going to reveal itself as a perfect theoretical line. It was going to behave like nature often does at its most important thresholds. It was going to blur, complicate, and force humility. That uncertainty only made the moment more gripping. Because the heliopause was no longer just a concept in models. It had become a place with personality, a place where assumptions had to bend, a place where the sun and the galaxy met not in ideal geometry, but in a physical reality far subtler than diagrams could prepare us for. Eventually, the evidence became overwhelming. Voyager 1 had crossed into interstellar space in 2012. Voyager 2 would do the same years later, giving humanity a second crossing through a different region of the heliosphere. Together, the two spacecraft confirmed something that had once felt almost philosophical. The solar system, in the deepest physical sense, possesses a protective boundary, and that boundary can be crossed. Think for a moment about what that means. For thousands of years, human beings drew borders across land and sea, over deserts and rivers, through language and empire. Then we learned to draw maps of planets, moons, and stars. But the heliopause is something stranger than any old border. It is not political. It is not visible. It is not fixed in the way mountains are fixed. It is a dynamic frontier made of pressure, plasma, fields, and motion. It is the point where the outward force of the sun is finally balanced and overcome by the interstellar medium beyond. It is the place where our cosmic shelter stops being the dominant condition. That alone makes it one of the most extraordinary boundaries we have ever encountered. And yet the crossing itself remained almost eerily quiet. There was no ceremony in space, only measurements traveling home across billions of miles, tiny fluctuations in a signal, instruments still functioning after decades, engineers and scientists on Earth listening to the faint testimony of a machine that had outlived the world that built it. There is something deeply moving in that image. Civilization did not stride into interstellar space with fanfare. It leaned in and listened. That is one reason Voyager's crossing feels so intimate despite its scale. It was not a triumph of force, it was a triumph of endurance. The spacecraft was old, its systems were limited, its power was slowly fading. It had survived long enough to answer a question far larger than its original mission. That gives the entire moment a strange kind of tenderness. A machine launched when computers were primitive by modern standards, when the digital world was barely taking shape. became the first artifact of Earth to touch the medium between the stars. And what it found was not emptiness. This may be the most important lesson of all. We often speak of interstellar space as though it were simply nothing, a blank gulf, a vast absence separating one star from another. But Voyager showed that this is not true, at least not in any meaningful physical sense. The interstellar medium is real. It has density, however thin. It has plasma. It has magnetic structure. It has particles carrying energies born from distant cosmic violence. It exerts pressure. It pushes back against stars. It shapes the size and form of stellar bubbles like our heliosphere. In other words, the darkness between the stars is not empty. It is inhabited by physics. That realization changes the feeling of the galaxy itself. The stars are no longer isolated lanterns suspended in pure void. They are immersed in a medium, drifting through a larger environment, each one inflating its own sphere of influence against the surrounding sea. The Milky Way becomes less like a sparse collection of lights and more like a deep ocean of thin, cold, structured matter in which stars move like luminous currents. Voyager, by crossing the Heliopause, gave us our first direct contact with that ocean. And the first thing it taught us was how protective the heliosphere had been. Inside the heliosphere, the sun's outward wind helps reduce the intensity of some incoming galactic cosmic rays. Outside it, the intensity rises. This means the heliopause is not merely a boundary of identity. It is a boundary of exposure. Beyond it, the environment is harsher in a way that matters deeply for life, technology, and the long-term possibility of travel between stars. We do not simply live near the sun. We live inside its shelter. Voyager crossing the heliopause was, in a very real sense, the first moment human technology stepped beyond that shelter and began measuring what unshielded interstellar reality actually feels like. The implications are enormous. If humanity ever dreams seriously of reaching another star, then the heliopause is not just a scientific curiosity. It is the beginning of the real journey. Crossing it means leaving not only the planetary region, not only the familiar orbits, but the sun's broad protection itself. It means entering a medium where galactic cosmic rays are more intense, where the sun's magnetic order no longer dominates, where the ship is no longer traveling inside home, but outside it. Voyager did this without humans aboard, without even the possibility of return, and in doing so, it revealed how psychologically powerful that frontier really is. There is something almost mythic in the contrast between how monumental the event was and how little it resembled myth. No gates of fire, no angelic threshold, no cosmic music, just numbers, just fields, just particles. Just a signal crossing the dark to tell us that the invisible wall around our world had been passed. The most important moments in science often unfold this way, not as spectacles, but as subtle corrections to how reality is imagined. Voyager corrected the human imagination. It told us that the edge of the solar system is not where the planets end. It is where the sun's influence is no longer enough to define the local environment. That is a far stranger and more beautiful definition of home than most of us were ever taught. And there is another layer still. The heliopause is not static. It shifts as solar activity changes. It responds to the interstellar medium around it. It may ripple, fluctuate, breathe in and out over time. That means Voyager did not cross a frozen monument. It crossed a living boundary, and one shaped by the changing conversation between our star and the galaxy. This makes the event even more fascinating. It was not just a crossing through space. It was a crossing through a particular condition of space at a particular time in the sun's long journey through the Milky Way. In that sense, Voyager's achievement becomes almost historical on a cosmic scale. It did not merely find the edge of the heliosphere. It found the edge of the heliosphere as it existed in our era, under our solar conditions, within our region of the interstellar medium. The crossing was both universal and specific. It taught us a general truth about stars and their boundaries, but it also captured a fleeting state of our own stellar bubble. This makes the spacecraft feel less like an instrument and more like a witness. A witness to the moment the sun's authority thinned into galactic space. A witness to the transition from sheltered to exposed. A witness to the realization that the interstellar medium is not some poetic abstraction, but a real environment pressing against the place where we live. A witness, too, to the fragility of our cosmic comfort. Because once you know the heliosphere exists, and once you know it protects us in part from the harsher radiation of the galaxy, then home becomes at once larger and more vulnerable. We are not floating in neutral darkness. We are nested in a temporary shield made by a star. That thought has a way of lingering. It means Earth is not merely one planet among many. It is one planet among many living inside a giant stellar cocoon whose edges are constantly negotiated with interstellar space. It means our local conditions are part of a much larger structure. It means the true outskirts of home are not frozen planets or distant icy bodies alone, but invisible thresholds far beyond them. It means that what keeps us safe is not only close at hand, but stretched across the entire breadth of the solar system. Voyager turned all of that from theory into contact. And then there is the loneliness of what came after. Once the Heliopause was crossed, Voyager did not arrive somewhere bustling or bright. It arrived in deeper cold, in a medium still extraordinarily thin, still unimaginably empty by human standards, but no longer shaped by the sun in the same way. Behind it lay the layered skin of the heliosphere. Ahead lay the long dark of interstellar space. The spacecraft had become the first human-made object to exist, truly and directly, between the stars. The silence of that image is almost unbearable if you let yourself dwell on it long enough. A metal craft, carrying a golden record of Earth's sounds and images, moving through a region no eye will ever naturally see, its signal taking many hours to return, its creators aging, retiring, dying, generations passing below while it continues farther into the night. And all the while, it keeps telling us the same thing in different forms. The universe is more structured than it looks. The borders of home are more subtle than we imagined. Protection exists, but it ends. And beyond that ending, the galaxy begins not with drama, but with persistence. Perhaps that is the deepest emotional truth of the Heliopause. It is not just the edge of the solar system shield. It is the edge of innocence in our picture of space. Before Voyager, we could still imagine the outer dark as a simple backdrop. After Voyager, it became harder to preserve that simplicity. Now we know there is a boundary. We know it matters. We know it can be crossed. We know interstellar space has its own character. And we know that our place in the cosmos is wrapped in layers of hidden structure we are only beginning to understand. The Heliopause did not end the mystery. It made the mystery more honest. Because once you have crossed the sun's final frontier, another realization waits immediately beyond it. If interstellar space is real, physical, structured, and full of cosmic rays and plasma and magnetic order, then the darkness between stars is not merely a road, it is an environment in its own right. And that means the question is no longer only where the solar system ends. The question becomes what kind of galaxy surrounds us, presses against us, and has been there all along while we looked up and imagined emptiness. Voyager's crossing was the first answer, but only the first. So as the spacecraft drifted beyond the Heliopause, one thing became impossible to ignore. The sun, for all its power, does not own eternity around it. Its reach is vast, but finite. Its shield is real, but limited. And the moment a human-made machine crossed beyond that shield, the solar system stopped being just our neighborhood and started feeling like an island surrounded by a colder, stranger sea. If that image stays with you, let it, because it should. And if you want to keep following Voyager into the true darkness beyond the sun's last protection, subscribe to the channel, because what the spacecraft discovered in interstellar space was not emptiness at all, but something far more unsettling. A hidden ocean of matter and radiation drifting between the stars. Beyond the sun's final protection, Voyager did not enter emptiness. That may be the most surprising sentence in the entire story. For generations, the phrase interstellar space carried a certain emotional meaning. It suggested loneliness beyond measure, silence without texture, a gulf so absolute that it could barely be thought of as a place at all. Between the stars, we imagined a kind of elegant nothingness, a frozen gap where distance itself was the only real feature. But when Voyager crossed the Heliopause and began sending data from the true interstellar medium, that old image began to dissolve. The darkness between stars was not empty. It was thin, yes, almost impossibly thin by human standards, but not absent, not neutral, not a blank. It was a physical environment, and one far stranger than most people had ever pictured. This is where Voyager's journey becomes almost unsettling in its implications. Because once the spacecraft moved beyond the sun's broad protective bubble, it began measuring a realm that had shaped our solar system from the outside all along. A realm that pressed against the heliosphere, distorted it, limited it, and quietly reminded us that even our star exists inside something larger. The interstellar medium was no longer a theoretical backdrop. It became contact. And the first thing contact revealed was that the galaxy has weather of its own. Not weather in the familiar human sense of rain or cloud or wind moving through breathable air, but a deeper and more alien kind of weather. Plasma density, magnetic direction, high energy radiation, charged particles crossing vast distances after being accelerated by ancient cosmic violence. Pressure distributed through a medium so sparse that any earthly vacuum would seem crowded by comparison. Interstellar space, it turned out, was not a passive gap between stars. It was a dark sea with structure. That changes the emotional meaning of the Milky Way itself. The stars are no longer isolated lights pinned to a static background. They are immersed. They drift inside a larger medium. They move through regions with different properties, different pressures, different magnetic conditions. Every star, perhaps every planetary system, must negotiate with that surrounding environment. In that sense, the galaxy begins to feel less like a silent arrangement of objects and more like a vast ocean of extremely thin matter within which stars carve temporary zones of influence. Voyager did not merely leave home. It became the first messenger to tell us what the ocean feels like beyond our own star's protective reach, and what it felt was harsher. Inside the heliosphere, the solar wind and the sun's magnetic influence help reduce some of the flux of galactic cosmic rays. Not all of them, not perfectly, but enough that the heliosphere functions as a broad shield. Outside it, Voyager began recording a different reality. Galactic cosmic rays rose to levels that reflected a less protected environment. This was one of the clearest signs that interstellar space is not merely distant. It is active in ways that matter. It contains radiation born from some of the most violent processes in the universe, from exploding stars and energetic astrophysical events that happened long before human beings existed. The quiet between stars is seeded with the afterlives of catastrophe. There is something deeply eerie about that. To stand under a calm night sky on Earth is to feel stillness. Yet far beyond the atmosphere, far beyond the planets, and farther still beyond the heliosphere, the galaxy is saturated with traces of ancient destruction. Particles accelerated to enormous energies race through interstellar space as relics of stellar death, magnetic upheaval, and cosmic shock waves. Voyager began to measure that reality directly. It told us that the darkness between stars is not simply cold. It is charged with memory. And that word matters. Memory. Because interstellar space is full of things that have traveled for vast stretches of time. A particle can carry the signature of an event unimaginably far away. A magnetic field can preserve information about large-scale structures in the galaxy. Even the local plasma density can reveal something about the environment through which our solar system is moving. Voyager was not just entering a new region. It was entering a library written in particles and fields. This is one reason the mission feels so much larger than the spacecraft itself. Voyager had no grand camera scenes left to offer. It was not discovering exotic alien cities or glowing landscapes. It was doing something quieter and, in its own way, more extraordinary. It was letting human beings touch the physical reality of interstellar space for the first time, not through metaphor, through measurement, and those measurements came with surprises. One of the most fascinating findings involved plasma density. Once beyond the heliopause, Voyager detected that the surrounding medium was denser than many people had intuitively imagined. Still extraordinarily sparse, of course. Nothing close to air, nothing close to any earthly environment, but denser than the plasma within certain regions of the heliosphere. This mattered because it gave scientists a clearer sense of the interstellar environment pressing against our solar system. The space beyond the heliosphere was not merely more hostile in radiation, it was also materially distinct with its own properties and structure. That helped transform interstellar space from abstraction into place. There is a subtle difference between saying something exists and feeling that it is a world of conditions. Before Voyager, interstellar space often lived in the imagination as a concept. After Voyager, it began to feel like an actual medium with personality. It has density, it has pressure, it has magnetic behavior, it resists and shapes the heliosphere, it carries particles from remote cosmic events. It hums, in a sense, with the low persistent activity of a galaxy that is never truly still. One of the eeriest aspects of this new reality emerged through the detection of plasma oscillations. Disturbances moving through the interstellar medium could create subtle vibrations in the local plasma, which Voyager's instruments helped interpret. These oscillations became a kind of indirect music of the deep. Not sound in the ordinary human sense, because space does not carry sound the way air does, but a measurable rhythm in the charged environment beyond the sun's boundary. For many people, this became one of the most haunting dimensions of the mission. The space between stars was not silent in the absolute sense. It had structure that could vibrate, respond, and be translated into a kind of cosmic tone. There is something almost dreamlike in that. A machine built on Earth, launched decades ago, drifting beyond the solar system's protective bubble and detecting the subtle pulse of plasma in interstellar space. It feels less like engineering and more like a strange act of listening, as if humanity, after millennia of staring at the stars, finally pressed its ear against the dark and heard that it was not empty after all. And once that realization arrives, it becomes difficult to go back to the older image of the universe, because emptiness is easier to imagine than thin complexity. A void asks nothing of you except scale, but a medium asks for deeper thought. It asks you to imagine the galaxy not as a set of isolated points, but as a continuous environment through which those points move. It asks you to think of stars not merely as sources of light, but as objects embedded in and resisting a larger sea. It asks you to imagine that between one civilization and another, if such civilizations exist, there lies not merely distance, but a real physical domain filled with radiation, magnetism, and tenuous matter. The challenge of reaching the stars is no longer only a problem of propulsion. It is also a problem of survival through an environment that is both sparse and unforgiving. Voyager hints at that with profound clarity. The spacecraft itself was never meant to travel to another star. It was not built for human passage. It was not even designed to keep working forever. And yet, by surviving long enough to cross the heliopause, it offered a first lesson in what lies outside the sun's shelter. That lesson is both thrilling and sobering. Interstellar space is not an obstacle only because it is large. It is an obstacle because it is real. Real in the way deep oceans are real. Real in the way deserts are real. Real in the way storms are real, even if their winds are made not of air but of charged particles and radiation fields. And this should change how we think about the romance of the stars. For centuries, the phrase "reach the stars" has carried a certain nobility. It suggests courage, expansion, destiny, and perhaps those things remain true. But Voyager adds another layer, a darker and more honest one. To reach the stars is not to move through emptiness toward light. It is to leave a region of relative shelter and cross an immense, irradiated, magnetized sea where the remnants of stellar explosions are already moving faster than any dream we have yet built. The stars are not separated by blankness. They are separated by a medium that remembers violence. That does not make the dream smaller. It makes it more real, and perhaps more beautiful too. Because the interstellar medium is not only hostile, it is also connective. It links stars to one another in a material sense. It is the environment out of which new stars form and into which old stars release their matter. The gas and dust and plasma between the stars are part of the galaxy's long cycle of death and renewal. Voyager entered a realm that is both the consequence of ancient cosmic events and the raw setting for future ones. In that sense, interstellar space is not the absence between meaningful places. It is one of the galaxy's most meaningful places. That is an astonishing correction to the human imagination. We are used to valuing solid things: planets, moons, asteroids, comets. We love surfaces because surfaces can be pictured. But Voyager revealed that the medium between surfaces may hold some of the deepest truths. It is where stars meet resistance. It is where cosmic rays travel. It is where magnetic fields stretch across impossible scales. It is where the solar system's boundary is negotiated. And it is where a lone spacecraft carrying the sounds and images of Earth continues to drift as a tiny artifact of one world crossing a vast galactic sea. There is something almost unbearable in the loneliness of that image. Voyager is not traveling through scenic grandeur. It is traveling through condition, through a realm that can barely be seen but can absolutely be measured. The sun behind it, still powerful but no longer dominant. The nearest stars still impossibly far ahead. Around it, the interstellar medium thin as a ghost and yet real enough to press on the heliosphere, real enough to alter particle counts, real enough to define the environment of the deep galaxy. The spacecraft becomes less like an explorer in the old heroic sense and more like a drifting witness, reporting that the darkness has substance. And perhaps that is what makes this chapter of the mission so hypnotic. It does not rely on spectacle. It relies on correction. It tells us that the universe is more continuous than it appears. That blackness can be structured. That distance can be filled with consequences. That even what we call nothing may, under closer listening, turn out to be full of history, tension, and invisible form. It also forces a more humbling question about ourselves. If all life on Earth evolved inside the heliosphere, protected in part from the full exposure of interstellar radiation, then how much of our story has unfolded because of a shield we barely understood until recently? How much does the interstellar environment matter to the long rhythm of habitability, to the radiation conditions surrounding our planet over geological time, to the subtle cosmic background against which biology took shape? Voyager did not answer all of this, but it made the questions harder to ignore. It suggested that the conditions for life may depend not only on a planet and a star, but also on the structure of the stellar bubble around that star and the nature of the galactic environment pressing against it. That means interstellar space is not only relevant once you leave home, it may have been shaping home all along. This is a profound shift in perspective. The galaxy is no longer a distant stage upon which the solar system sits. It becomes part of the system's ongoing context. The interstellar medium presses against the heliosphere, influencing its shape and perhaps its shielding power. The sun moves through different galactic regions over immense spans of time. Conditions change, boundaries respond. The environment beyond our system is not merely outside us. It participates in defining the outer terms of our existence. Voyager made that intimate. And then there is the unsettling possibility that our heliosphere is only one local answer to a broader galactic rule. If our star creates a protective bubble while moving through interstellar space, then countless other stars may do the same, each with their own astrospheres, each with their own negotiations against surrounding pressure, each wrapping whatever planets they possess in a unique envelope of protection or exposure. Suddenly, planetary systems across the galaxy begin to seem less like isolated collections of worlds and more like moving islands in a thin cosmic ocean, each surrounded by an invisible perimeter shaped by the struggle between star and medium. Voyager, by leaving ours, may have given us the first clear intuition of theirs. This makes the Milky Way feel both more populated and more lonely at once. More populated because the space between stars is no longer dead. More lonely because that space is vast, harsh, and physically consequential. Any message, any probe, Any dream of travel must pass through it. The galaxy is not empty theater. It is a medium with conditions, and that means the silence between stars may not be only a silence of distance, but a silence enforced by the difficulty of crossing an environment that does not forgive weakness. Still, there is an odd peace in this too. The interstellar medium may be harsh, but it is not chaotic in the ordinary sense. It has order. It has measurable behavior. It can be studied, listened to, understood. Voyager's data does not make the darkness feel less mysterious, but it makes the mystery more grounded. The galaxy is not withholding itself behind fantasy. It is revealing itself through physics. And physics, when followed patiently enough, becomes a form of storytelling more powerful than myth. That is what Voyager offered from beyond the Heliopause. A story told in rising cosmic rays, in plasma oscillations, in magnetic fields, in the densities of a medium that human beings once treated as almost synonymous with nothing. It taught us that the dark between stars is not merely where things are absent, it is where other truths begin. And that is why this phase of the mission may be even more astonishing than the famous planetary flybys. Jupiter was spectacular, Saturn was sublime, Uranus and Neptune rewrote worlds. But interstellar space rewrote the backdrop of all worlds. It told us that the stage itself is alive with structure. It turned the black behind the planets into something tangible. Once you understand that, the entire solar system changes again. It no longer sits in majestic isolation. It floats inside a galaxy that touches it, presses it, surrounds it, limits it. The Heliopause is no longer merely a border crossed, once in triumph. It is the meeting point between our local shelter and the larger sea beyond. And Voyager, drifting farther into that sea, continues to remind us that home is not defined only by what we contain, but by what contains us in return. So the question now becomes even deeper. If interstellar space is structured, if the solar system is only one bubble drifting through that structure, then what does that say about the true shape of our cosmic neighborhood? What hidden asymmetries, pressures, and regional changes in the galaxy are still influencing the form of the heliosphere itself? What else about home have we mistaken for emptiness simply because it was too subtle to see? Voyager has not stopped asking those questions. It carries them farther every day, farther into a realm where the sun's voice is weaker and the galaxy's own conditions become more direct. And the deeper it goes, the more impossible it becomes to think of the night sky in simple terms again. The darkness is not blank. It is inhabited by fields, particles, memory, pressure, and ancient violence diffused across unimaginable time. It is a place, it is a medium, it is the true between. And if that quiet revelation has changed the way you look at the stars, subscribe to the channel and stay with me. Because the final step in this journey is the most unsettling of all. Voyager did not just show us what lies beyond the solar system, it forced us to rethink what the solar system itself really is. By the time Voyager entered interstellar space, it had already done something far more unsettling than simply travel farther than any spacecraft before it. It had forced us to admit that the solar system we thought we knew was never the full solar system at all. For most of human history, home was defined by what we could see. First the ground beneath our feet, then the moon, then the wandering planets. Then the sun at the center of a vast celestial order. Even after modern astronomy expanded our perspective, there was still something deceptively neat about the way we imagined our place. The solar system became a family of worlds, arranged around a star, each with its own orbit, its own mood, its own face turned toward the dark. It was an elegant model, useful, beautiful, almost comforting in its balance. But Voyager, by continuing long after the planets were gone, slowly dismantled that comfort. It taught us that the planets are not the outer frame of our system. They are only the brightest inhabitants of a far larger and more fragile structure. That realization may be Voyager's greatest discovery. Not Jupiter's storms, though they were astonishing. Not Saturn's rings, though they remain among the most haunting images ever captured. Not the strange blue distance of Neptune, or the tilted isolation of Uranus. Those wonders changed our knowledge of worlds, but what came later changed our knowledge of home itself. Because once Voyager revealed the heliosphere, the termination shock, the Helios sheath, the Heliopause, and finally the physical reality of interstellar space, the solar system stopped being a set of orbits and became something else entirely. It became a moving bubble of influence, protection, pressure, and compromise, drifting through a galactic sea. And that is a much stranger thing to belong to. It means our home is not defined only by the sun's gravity. Gravity is essential, of course. It binds the planets and shapes their motion. But Voyager showed that the sun defines its larger territory through more than gravity alone. It defines it through wind, magnetism, particle flow, and the ability to carve out a region against the surrounding interstellar medium. The true solar system is not merely what circles the sun. It is also what the sun can push back into the galaxy. It is the size of the sun's resistance. It is the shape of the shelter created by its breath. That changes the emotional scale of everything. Because once you accept that idea, Earth is no longer simply one planet orbiting one star. Earth becomes a world nested deep inside an invisible cocoon, protected in part by the outward force of a star that has been shaping space around it for billions of years. Every ocean wave, every volcanic age, every forest, every animal migration, every civilization, every quiet evening under the stars, all of it happened inside this vast protective bubble. Humanity did not just grow up in the solar system. Humanity grew up inside the heliosphere, though we did not understand its true meaning until Voyager touched its edge. That should make the entire night sky feel different, because the sky we look up at seems open, transparent, infinite in a very immediate way. Yet Voyager revealed that we have always looked out from within layers. First atmosphere, then magnetosphere, then the broadest shield of all, the heliosphere itself. The stars beyond were never merely distant points in an unfiltered void. They were being viewed from inside the sun's extended domain. And when Voyager crossed the heliopause, it did more than travel outward. It crossed the last great invisible layer of home. This is why the mission becomes almost philosophical in its final meaning. Voyager did not simply tell us what lies beyond the solar system. It redefined what the words beyond the solar system even mean. Before Voyager, many people would have imagined that leaving the solar system meant passing the orbit of Neptune, or perhaps drifting beyond Pluto into some final darkness. But that old intuition now feels far too small. The solar system does not end at the last major planet. It does not end where our diagrams become inconvenient. It ends where the sun's local authority gives way to the larger authority of the galaxy. That is a much deeper definition. And it is also far more haunting because it means that home is not a fixed architecture of worlds. It is a temporary zone of influence, and its shape depends on an ongoing struggle with what surrounds it. In other words, home has weather. Not weather of clouds and rain, but weather of pressure and field and cosmic exposure. The heliosphere can expand and contract. It can change as solar activity rises and falls. It can be compressed by the interstellar medium through which the solar system moves. It can be stretched, distorted, reshaped. That means the boundary of our home is not eternal in form. It is dynamic. It responds to conditions. It breathes in the broadest sense available to physics. And once that becomes real to you, the solar system begins to feel less like a possession and more like a condition. We are not simply inside a location. We are inside an arrangement of forces that happens to exist because the sun is active, because it emits wind, because it carries magnetic influence outward, because it moves through the galaxy, and because the surrounding interstellar medium presses back with its own silent persistence. The solar system is therefore not only a place, it is a negotiation. Voyager revealed that with astonishing clarity. It taught us that our cosmic neighborhood is shaped not by isolation, but by contact. This has consequences that reach beyond astronomy into the way we imagine existence itself. Human beings have always preferred boundaries we can see: shorelines, mountain ranges, walls, horizons. There is comfort in visible edges, but the true edge of our system is invisible. And not only invisible, but subtle. It must be inferred through particles, fields, changing densities. and the fading dominance of the solar wind. That means one of the most important borders in our existence was hidden from ordinary sight all along. The lesson is almost gentle in its severity. Reality does not owe us obviousness. Some of the deepest truths around us are not hidden because they are exotic. They are hidden because our instincts were trained on the wrong scale. Voyager corrected the scale. It taught us to think not just in terms of objects, but in terms of environments. Not just planets, but pressure systems. Not just worlds, but domains of influence. Not just stars, but their interaction with the galaxy around them. And once you make that adjustment, the Milky Way itself becomes stranger. If our sun has a heliosphere, then perhaps countless other stars have their own astrospheres, their own bubbles of wind and magnetism, each carved against the interstellar medium in a slightly different way. That would mean the galaxy is filled not only with stars and planets, but with overlapping regions of protection, distortion, and resistance. A dark ocean filled with invisible territories. A larger architecture hidden beneath the visible one. Voyager gave us our first direct intuition of that possibility. The mission was local in the most profound sense. It studied our own solar system. And yet, by revealing how our own stellar bubble behaves, it hinted at a universal principle. Stars do not merely shine. They push. They shape. They claim temporary room in the galaxy. Their planetary systems do not float naked in space, but ride inside these larger moving cocoons. That means the conditions for life, for radiation exposure, for long-term habitability, may depend not only on a star and its planets, but on the structure of the astrosphere surrounding them and the character of the interstellar medium outside. Suddenly, the search for life elsewhere becomes more layered. A habitable world may also need a habitable shelter on the scale of an entire star system. That is the kind of idea Voyager leaves behind in its wake. Quietly devastating, quietly expansive. The kind of idea that makes reality feel much larger without adding a single new planet. And yet there is something else about Voyager's final lesson that feels almost intimate. It is not only that the solar system is bigger than we thought. It is that it is more vulnerable than we thought. A bubble, after all, is protective, but it is also finite. Its very existence implies an outside. And once Voyager crossed into that outside, we were forced to confront what had always been waiting there: galactic cosmic rays, interstellar plasma, magnetic fields not governed by our sun. A harsher radiation environment, a medium shaped by ancient stellar explosions and the broad-scale dynamics of the Milky Way. The heliosphere had not been decorative. It had been defending us, in part, all along. The crossing of the Heliopause was therefore not just an exploration milestone. It was a revelation about exposure. It told us that the difference between inside and outside matters in ways we had barely begun to appreciate. That should change how we think about future exploration. To leave the solar system in the deepest physical sense is not simply to travel far. It is to depart from a region of relative shelter and enter a realm where the background conditions themselves grow more severe. Any future mission to another star would not merely be crossing distance. It would be crossing environmental regimes. It would have to survive beyond the sun's last protection for an unimaginable length of time. Voyager, without intending to become a pathfinder for interstellar travel, exposed the first truth of that journey. The greatest obstacle may not only be how far the stars are, it may be what the space between them is actually like. Still, there's a kind of solemn beauty in that. Voyager did not diminish the romance of space by making it more real. It deepened it. It replaced vague wonder with earned wonder. The darkness is not less magical because it contains plasma and magnetic fields and energetic particles. It is more magical because those realities are more astonishing than the empty stage we once imagined. Interstellar space is not blank. The solar system is not neatly bounded by the outermost planet. Home is not static. The galaxy is not merely a visual backdrop. Every one of these corrections makes the universe feel more alive, more layered, and more subtle. And perhaps that is why Voyager's journey continues to feel almost impossible in emotional scale. It is not just a machine moving away from Earth. It is a thought we launched into the dark, and the farther it goes, the more that thought returns transformed. At first, it asked what the outer planets are like. Then, it asked how far the sun truly extends. Then it asked what lies beyond the sun's final influence. And in the end, all those questions folded into one larger, more human question. What kind of place is home when you finally see its edges clearly? The answer is not simple. Home is larger than we imagined, because the sun's influence stretches far beyond the planets. Home is also stranger than we imagined, because its boundaries are invisible and dynamic. And home is more fragile than we imagined, because it exists inside a galaxy that presses upon it continuously. The solar system is not a sealed jewel box arranged in calm perfection around a star. It is a moving island of relative shelter inside a much harsher cosmic sea. That image may be Voyager's true inheritance, not the famous golden record, though that remains one of the most beautiful gestures in human history. Not the mythic status of being the farthest spacecraft, but the altered image of the solar system itself. Voyager taught us to stop thinking of our neighborhood as a tidy planetary diagram and start thinking of it as a living boundary system, a star's breath made visible through data, a great invisible harbor carrying worlds inside it, a cosmic tent stretched against the weather of the galaxy, and once you see it that way, the old textbook image becomes impossible to fully return to. The planets remain, their orbits remain. The sun still burns at the center. But behind that familiar order now lies another architecture, hidden and immense. The heliosphere swelling into the dark, the Helios heath under pressure, the Heliopause standing as the last threshold of solar protection, the interstellar medium beyond, not empty, but structured and severe. Voyager stitched these layers together into a new vision of home, a vision that is at once more scientific and more dreamlike than the one it replaced. Because in a strange way, Voyager did not merely discover facts, it discovered atmosphere. It revealed that our solar system has an outer mood, an invisible climate, a final skin where certainty fades. It discovered that what we thought was emptiness was actually relation, that what we thought was outside was actually touching us all along, that our home is defined not only by what is within it, but by what it resists beyond itself. That may be the most unsettling idea of all. We are not separate from the galaxy. We are buffered from it. There is a difference. And that difference is enormous. Every living thing on Earth has existed on the protected side of that difference. Voyager crossed to the other side, and still it goes on. There is something deeply moving in the fact that this old spacecraft continues to drift farther into interstellar space, carrying a weakening signal and a record of Earth's sounds and images. It has outlived presidents, eras, technologies, and assumptions. It has watched the solar system change shape in the human imagination. It has turned from a planetary explorer into a witness of the medium between stars. And every additional mile it travels seems to whisper the same lesson back to us. The farther you go, the less the universe resembles the neat stories you began with. That is not a reason for disappointment. It is the reason wonder survives. Because wonder does not come from simplicity. It comes from discovering that reality is deeper than the version of it you first learned. Voyager made the solar system deeper. It made the night sky less flat, less symbolic, and more physically alive. It reminded us that even our own neighborhood contains thresholds, hidden structures, and conceptual revolutions waiting in the dark. If that is true here, at home, then what else in the universe is still waiting for the right patient machine, the right patient mind, to drift far enough and listen closely enough to hear it? Perhaps that is the final feeling this story should leave behind. Not closure, but widening. Not a conclusion, but a quiet expansion of the possible. Voyager did not finish the story of the solar system. It opened it. It turned the edge of our system into the beginning of another question. It showed that the known world, when followed carefully enough, does not end. It becomes mysterious again. So now, when you picture the solar system, do not imagine only planets turning in silence around a central fire. Imagine something larger and more alive than that. Imagine a star breathing outward. Imagine an invisible shield stretched across unimaginable distances. Imagine that shield bending under galactic pressure. Imagine two ancient spacecraft slipping through its outer skin and telling us with fading voices that home was always bigger, stranger, and less protected than we knew. And if you want more stories like this, where science turns the dark into something even more beautiful and unsettling than fiction, subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the next descent into the quiet mysteries of the universe.